The last binding source we're going to look at here is the source property on a binding. If I wanted to get customers down into my data grid here, and I didn't want to rely on the data context being set to something that exposed that customer's collection, I could point explicitly to some source object that contained the customer collection. Now, the way you're typically going to do this when working with the source property on a binding is to define a resource on the current view that you're working with. It could be an application scoped resource in the window itself, down in some user control that you're working with, but a resource that's in scope for the element that's going to have the binding. And what I'm using here is a class called the collection view source. We covered the iCollection view interface in a previous module. This is an object that implements that, and you point to some source collection and it's going to wrap it in an iCollection view. We define this as a resource with a key so that we can refer to it somewhere else in the XAML. And the source can be set through a binding based on the data context. Once we've done that, we can drop down here to our data grid and change the item source here to say source equals, and basically we have to point to some object here. Now, really the only way to point to another object from within a binding is to use the static resource or dynamic resource markup extensions. And the static resource markup extension takes a key name of the object in a resource dictionary that you want to point to. So we just need to go up and grab our resource name that we just created, which is customer view source, and put that in the static resource markup extension. And you can see the squigglies go away. It's now pointing to that customer view source object. That's coming in as the source object and will provide the collection to the item source. So with that in place and one minor change to the code behind, I had to move my commands up to before I set the customer's context, because as the customers bind, it actually changes the selection, tries to use this command object, and if it wasn't initialized yet, it's null. That's going to throw a null reference exception. So we generally want to set up our commands earlier. I meant to put those before the loading of the data, so I've corrected that now. So with that in place, I go ahead and run. And we can see we have our customer's collection bound again, but now we're doing it through an explicit source reference on our binding that points to an object that provides a collection, which in this case happens to be a collection view source object that has bound itself through a data context binding to the customer's collection on the window. So this one demo shows you relative source self. It shows you relative source with an ancestor type. It shows you an element name binding, and it shows you a source binding, as well as a number of data context-based bindings.